Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part 4 of an ongoing series focused on endpoint protection in Configuration Manager, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Today's discussion will focus on firewall policies and the ability to configure those through Configuration Manager. So, here's the agenda, by the way. As we get started, really want to talk through why we're really even focused on this, right? So as we work through series like this, it's really about helping you be aware of capabilities that exist in the product today that you could leverage, might want to leverage that are built in and at your fingertips, right? There could be potential cost savings or scenarios where using capabilities such as what I will describe will be interesting. And then, also just the idea of being able to leverage these configurations with folks that might do, in this case, security, such as your security team through role-based access that you can apply in Configuration Manager. Another thing that I'll just mention here, because it is going to tie in a minute, is that, and I've mentioned this several times through the series so far, probably will mention it several more times, there will be a complementary series on this to Intune. Always think beyond just what you see in Configuration Manager. And I'll be honest right up front, the configurations that you can deploy in Config Manager for managing the firewall do leave a bit to be desired for many enterprises. May be perfect for you, right? But then the capabilities in Intune for doing this, which you'll see in a minute, are more robust. And you'll see the opposite of that in some cases. So, for example, when we get to the Windows Defender application control discussion, maybe it's application, I can't remember, but Config Manager is going to be more robust than what you can do in Intune. So just bear in mind, this is a series on Configuration Manager. We will do another series on Intune, and all of this again is part of Endpoint Manager. So there you go. So getting started in this, what are firewall policies? Whenever we really think about it, so there's really 3 areas. I'll mention these again. You'll see it again where firewall policies in Configuration Manager play. Right? Let me go ahead and catch up with the slide deck. Uh, and that's in 3 areas. First, the ability to enable and disable the firewall, the ability to determine whether or not you're going to accept or reject incoming connections, and then also whether you're going to notify the user when connections were blocked. So those are the 3 areas you can cover with Config Manager. Pretty simple, right? Um, and probably in your enterprise, you're going to have a need to be able to do more than just those things, right? So don't tune out now thinking that Config Manager can't help you with those, because there are places where Config Manager could. There's other options as well to augment what Config Manager can do that I will mention to you in a minute. Also, keep in mind the Intune thing, and I will actually, as part of this session, give you a brief preview into Intune. I debated whether to do that, but I thought, I'll just take a few minutes and go over to Intune and show what we will detail whenever we get to the Intune portion, at least for firewall, right? Why do we care about firewall policies? Well, again, these capabilities to have a firewall first and then to manage that firewall are built into Windows and built into Configuration Manager. So knowing about those, helping close knowledge gaps and so on, tell you what's possible, a big deal. Being able to consistently control how things work, so enterprise-wide control, giving that consistency and predictability when you do make these deployments. Again, just to put a teaser in there, there may be a need that you have for configuring things beyond what I'm going to show you is built into Config Manager, and you can do that, even using Config Manager. We'll talk about that in a second, right? So in terms of firewall policies, what are the requirements? Well, simply put, you need Windows devices. You need Configuration Manager to use Config Manager to manage those policies. And then you also need the Endpoint Protection agent enabled in client settings. So I actually tried without having the Endpoint Management agent enabled and the firewall settings just resulted in an error on the client side. Frankly, we don't. I looked back at the documentation as of this recording, and I did not see where we actually document endpoint protection agent as being required for firewall policies, but it definitely is. May have missed it, but either way, endpoint protection firewall policies or endpoint protection agent definitely necessary for firewall policies. So rehashing the capabilities for managing firewall policies. With Configuration Manager, you can definitely manage firewall status, whether the firewall is turned on, turned off. And then you can manage it for the different kind of connections you might have, like a domain connection or a local connection or whatever, right, on your NIC. You can manage incoming connections, whether to allow those or not. So if the firewall is turned on, do you want to allow incoming connections broadly or no, right? And then also user notification. When a connection is blocked, do you want to let the user know that the connection has been blocked? So a number of things that you might want to do would go, again, beyond this. You might want to specify, for example, what particular ports or whatever are allowed, instead of just saying incoming connections are allowed or not allowed with a big blanket statement, being able to configure the kinds of connections and ports and different things that are allowed might be of interest. And so there are some additional capabilities, not directly through Config Manager, but that you can manage with Config Manager to ultimately set these things. So if you set firewall policy with something like GPO, and by the way, you could definitely do that with GPO, then these settings would translate into the registry, well, largely, of machines. So if we know where the GPO settings are going to be built, then we could do something like compliance settings in Configuration Manager to go ahead and build out those settings so that you can manage them with Configuration Manager and augment your firewall policies. Right, there's also the ability with Intune, I'll show you in a minute, to do firewall policies. So we know that's going to work through the MDM channel of Windows 10. You can definitely configure CSP settings, Configuration Service Provider settings, with Config Manager. So that's an option as well. You could script this and so on, right? So again, this is where I'm saying don't look at just the capabilities in the Config Manager console and say, well, we can't do it with Config Manager. Yeah, you probably can. If you need to, right? And then you have other options as well. Okay, so now to the fun stuff, to the demo. This is pretty easy to configure, so let me pull in the Config Manager site server for a minute. So here's my site server. And the first place I'm going to go is under Administration. We have Client Settings here, right here. And if I go to Default Client Settings or whatever version of customized client settings you want, I just need to make sure that the endpoint protection agent is enabled, right? There's other options under there that you can pick and choose depending on your version of Windows 10, but all currently supported versions of Windows 10 should have endpoint protection agent that's there by default, so just turning it on is all you need, right? Then from there, it's really easy. You just go to Assets and Compliance and scroll down to the endpoint protection settings, and you have your, oops, dang it, didn't mean to do that, apologize. Come on, pop out, there. Pop out, okay, there, sorry. You have your policies you can set here, so here's your firewall policies. And you see that I have a demo firewall policy created and deployed. So if I just look at the properties of this, you'll see that the options that I have are literally enable Windows Defender Firewall. I have domain, private or public profile, and I've turned all of those to no. So all of these down below are grayed out. So I could say yes, right, which would enable me to configure these. So for my domain profile, I could then decide, hey, block all incoming connections, yes or no, and then notify the user when a connection's been blocked, yes or no, right? And so that's really it. And so when, again, I didn't have this turned on, so I'll just say no again. So I've created this policy. I've deployed out this policy to my all systems collection just because this is my lab. When you deploy it, you're going to have to choose a collection of devices, right? So I just chose all systems in production. I would definitely not just choose all systems. And then you decide whatever schedule you want this thing to run on and evaluate on. By default, 7 days. You can always get in and manually trigger it too, right? So pretty easy, right? Now, let's take a breather for a minute and see this actually on a client in action, right? So you saw the configured firewall policy. Let me pull in the client machine here. And I'm going to start by opening the config manager applet. Here we go. And I'm going to pop open config manager. So these come down as compliance settings. If I go into configurations, you're going to see demo, my Windows Firewall setting. You see that it is compliant, right? I can evaluate that as I'm sitting here, no problem. And so it's running and will not update really because it's not going to change. But so there you go, right? So really, really, really easy. One thing that and it just flashed, so it just finished evaluating. Since I'm in the firewall or in the control panel, I'll go down to the firewall and look. So I basically said disable everything. And you see that I'm having my firewall settings controlled by config manager, and they are all, in fact, disabled, right? So very, very easy. Now, you can troubleshoot this if you need to by looking in the logs, and the endpoint protection log is the one you care about. And so if you search for firewall, then you're going to see here that the firewall agent, the firewall provider, is not installed. And so it had to be installed, right? This is whenever I was testing this to see if I could do this without the endpoint agent, and I could not. I tried, and the configuration item evaluated and was in an error condition. So I had to use, or I had to enable it, and when I enabled it, it went ahead and installed the configuration manager firewall provider, and then from there, all good, right? And we can evaluate and do whatever. So the log is a very good indicator of that fact. So that's really the skinny that I wanted to show you for the config manager client. But let me shift over because I want you to understand what is possible if we add Intune to the mix. And we aren't going to spend much time here, but I do want to give you a flavor of what we have, right? So I'm in the Intune console. And so if I go down to endpoint security and then I choose firewall, you're going to see a few settings. So the first is I don't have any policies created. I can go create a policy, right? So I'm going to create a policy. And then in the list, I'm going to have Windows 10 or later, Mac OS, Windows 10 or later, config manager. So why do I have two of these, Windows 10 or later, one labeled config manager, one not, right? Well, the answer is, and I'll pop this open, right? If I go create this, here we go, and click create and give it a name, which I don't care what the name is, go next, right? You look at the settings that are available here, and there are a couple more, but largely they're the same. You can enable the firewall, you can configure your profiles and what response they're going to have, and so I'm going to say true, then I get a few more options here, right? Allow local policy, certainly more than what I have in config manager itself, right? And then the others for the private profiles and such. Right? So right away, even if you're doing management for config manager, you see that the UI in the Intune console, and I really shouldn't call it the Intune console, this is really the endpoint manager console. And the reason you see these labeled as config manager is as we progress with our tenant attached strategy, where we're trying to put the options that you can have in the config manager console also in the endpoint manager console, this is what you're going to get, right? This is where we're focusing a lot of our efforts. to bring parity and more, in this case, to what you could do just in the config manager console by itself, right? So you see that here, and that's what this is. So if I leave here and then just go back to endpoint security again, go back to firewall, and then look at the other option. So create a policy. This other option is for a device that is managed by Intune. So in this scenario, think co-management. There are certain workloads that you could decide to shift from config manager to Intune. Endpoint protection would be one of them, right? And it might make sense. So as you evaluate what your options are in Intune, in config manager, and decide Intune has a better lay of the land for what you're trying to accomplish, maybe that's one of those that you shift, right? So here we see that we have the firewall settings, and then we also have rules. So just again, so I can progress, click next, and Defender Firewall loading. And so here you see some of the options that are available. Again, I'm not digging into these because that's not the point of this discussion right now, but I do want to show it to you. Let me show you another. So the rules part. So I have the ability to do firewall rules. I'm going to create that. And so here you can literally sit and create the rules that you care about for your firewall configuration. So I'm going to add a rule, and then I have a wizard here where or a dialog here where I have options about what direction I'm going to allow, what type of networks, application settings, just different things. And this is where you can really get granular and do the kind of configurations that you might want to do, right? So let's close out of this, close out of that. And then last one I'll just quickly show you is Mac OS. So we can configure firewalls on the Mac OS as well. And so pretty simply, just give it a name, click next. And then my settings are whether I want to enable the firewall or not, and then I get to choose what particular application firewall apps that I want, right? So just like before, I can add and give details and so on. And that's as far as I want to take you for the Intune portion of this. We'll talk about Intune in more detail and see it work in a series with Intune. Okay, so starting to wrap up, just some troubleshooting tips and tricks. So I've already talked to you about the Endpoint Protection Agent log, where you can see the different firewall configurations, the configuration of the firewall provider, and so on. I also want to show you something real quick, just in the spirit of learning, right? So I mentioned that the settings that we are seeing come down as part of configuration items. Well, configuration items make up a whole number of things that you can do in Configuration Manager. So I'm popping up the database. So this should immediately say, look, don't touch, right? Learn, but don't mess with. And if you need to mess with, for some reason you think you need to, that needs to be with a Microsoft person on the phone with you, right? Okay, so I'm going to do a new query. And so let's just say that I want to find out the source of my configuration. So I could do that by saying select star from CI underscore CI assignments, right? And so I know these tables, and so I know where my assignments are going to live, and I'm going to backtrack from my assignments to get to ultimately the piece that I care about, right? So I'm going to execute that, and I'm going to find all of my assignments. And so as I scroll down, as soon as this gets out of the way, as I scroll down, I'm going to see that the last one is not my BitLocker, my firewall policy right here. Yes, I renamed it, so that's it. Just making sure. Okay, good. So now what I need is the assignment ID. So I'm going to copy that to my clipboard. Then I'm going to go make another query to track backwards. So select star from CI underscore assignment targeted CIs, where assignment ID equals assignment ID equals that I copied to my clipboard, and I'm going to run just that, execute. Okay, so now I have my assignment ID, and notice what else I have. I have my CI ID. Well, that's what I want. That's gold. And so every configuration item has its own unique ID. So I'm going to say select star from CI underscore configuration items, where CI underscore ID equals, and put that in, and then query that, and I get back the one configuration item that I care about. So if I want to see the configuration, I'm just going to click on SDM Package Digest. I can copy that out to Notepad. So let me open up Notepad, and we're just going to copy that in. And with this, I can go through my entire configuration and see what's going on. So if there's something, so here's the renamed name of this. I renamed it to Demo Firewall Policy. That's what you saw. I can go through this and see all the settings, what I've configured it to, whatever, in the XML. So I share that with you not because you should really ever have to do that, but more because of education, teaching how things work, and so on, right? Okay, so in terms of remediation happens kind of on its own, by default. You don't have to turn on remediation. We try to fix settings so that they adhere to whatever you configure when we apply the policy and so on, right? In terms of tips and tricks, so there are some best practices when dealing with firewall. These are not specifically regarding config manager, though some could apply. So the first one is keep your default settings. So when you open the Windows Defender Firewall for the first time, you're going to see the default settings that are applicable to the local computer. Keep those so that you always know what you can return to if you need to. Understand the precedence of inbound rules. So when you configure these things, if you don't understand the precedence and how things flow for your inbound rules, that can cause you some heartache. Create rules for new applications before the first launch so that those applications will work without a problem. Leverage automatic rule creations for applications. So that can happen, and some apps allow for that. Establish local policy. Merge and application rules, and this comes to the idea of having a couple of sources of configuration and being able to kind of work with those in tandem and so on. Understand what's called shields up mode for active attack, where you can just force the firewall to start to block some connections, and understand what shields up mode means. Understand the implications of creating outbound rules, and then finally, document your changes so that you know what you've done, and as you're thinking about modifying them later, you have a good source to go back to. And folks, with that, that is the session that I wanted to share with you on Firewall. We will do this again when we get to Intune and spend more time over there, but for now, thanks for hanging out, and we will see you next time.